Hello, we've reached the half century. Welcome to episode 50 of Sport on Lots, the podcast analysing the week's sports news. It's a happy new year and starting the year alongside me, Rob Harris from the Associated Press as ever, fully refreshed from a break writing, if not podcasting, is Tarek Panja from the New York Times and Martin Ziegler from the Times. Happy 2022. Some big media news to start the year, isn't there?
Well, the $550 million takeover of The Athletic.
Some news a bit close to home.
Don't know what you're on about, guys. What are we talking about this week, then?
Well, we're talking about us for the start. Some big recognition from the Sports Podcast Awards. After barely a year on air, we've been shortlisted for the Best News and Current Affairs Podcast at the Sports Podcast Awards.
That's excellent. Excellent. Is it? How do you vote for this? Is it an online vote? Because if so, can I urge all our followers and subscribers and listeners to get on the website and vote for us?
And that site is sportspodcastawards.com. If you hit register with your real identity, you then have the option to go through to the News and Current Affairs category. You'll then see our pod. If you can give us a click on that, you then get the option to listen and vote. And if you do look closely at the list, you'll see us listed as independent, because if you didn't realise, there is no big corporation behind this pod. No one offering $550 billion for us yet.
What would you do? What would you do, Rob, with $550 million?
Well, maybe someone else could be making us sound coherent on the editing, rather than the many hours it takes each week. Or you could get the raw version of all the audio tracks. That could be a premium product, rather than the hopefully smooth episode coming up. And that will begin with us talking to Jacquelin Magnay, the correspondent from the Australian newspaper, who's going to have the inside track on the Novak Djokovic visa standoff saga. Then we'll dig deeper into the change in boardroom leadership at Manchester United as Ed Woodward's reign ends. Just how much of a success or flop has he been? We'll then head to Barcelona, where we'll explore the club's finances and ask just how they can afford the deals they're touting. It wouldn't be Sport on Lots without some FIFA news. We'll discuss why the UK and Ireland 2030 World Cup bid looks over. But what do they plan to bid for instead? Wait and listen. In the world of corporate bidding, it's the takeover. That's the talk of the media and sport. What does the sale of The Athletic tell us about the future of sports journalism? And if you stick around, you'll find out which English rugby team could be the next one breaching the salary cap. But we're starting in Australia, and wouldn't we mind being there in the sun rather than the cold of England at the moment, but perhaps not inside the COVID quarantine hotel where Novak Djokovic is holed up as we record. Will he get out in time to defend his Australian Open title, or will he be sent back to the airport and flown out to Melbourne? It's the saga gripping not just Australia, but so many around the world. And at the heart of it, what was the medical exemption that Novak Djokovic gained to get around the COVID vaccine requirements for all players? They're only granted under exceptional medical circumstances or if you've got an acute condition, and that certainly hasn't been disclosed yet. What also hasn't been made clear is just why his visa was revoked. Was it all about whether he could prove he had COVID in the last 6 months and that made him exempt? Well, to shed light on all of this, we are joined now by Jacquelin Magnay from The Australian. Welcome to the pod. Happy New Year.
Yes, thanks. And to everyone else out there too.
How have you found this in terms of the reaction in Australia in particular, in terms of where any sympathies might lie to the predicament of Djokovic?
Well, in Australia, there are no sympathies for Novak Djokovic. It's very pro-lockdown, pro-hard border. There's no sympathy at all for him. In fact, I've had many messages from several friends saying this is the greatest decision ever. I think, though, that Australians have spent 2 years locked up. They cannot travel. It's a very inward-looking society at the moment. And the views of Australians have to be also looked at in their own experiences. They have to currently, to even go and have a cup of coffee sometimes in some places, you have to show your vaccination certificate. And this is a country that has driven a lot of fear-mongering and misinformation as well. But it has got its vaccination rates up above 90%, which is really extraordinary. So the entire nation feels that they've done their bit for the health of society and to keep Omicron and Delta out of the country as much as possible. And they feel that Novak Djokovic perhaps is being given special treatment to access the country and to play a tennis match, which has not gone down well at all.
When Djokovic, I mean, he set off with the expectation everything was sorted out. I mean, is there a bit of a failure of the Australian authorities in sort of giving him the message it was all okay to come, and then he arrives and suddenly ends up in a detention facility having to appeal the decision? It sort of seems strange to me that everything hadn't been sorted out before he even travelled.
It's incredibly strange because I've just travelled to Australia and I have family who are in a similar position to Novak, who are foreign nationals trying to get into the country. And the border is still closed to foreign nationals. So you have to apply for a visa. You then have to apply for an exemption from the Border Force Commissioner. And in Novak's case, he then had to apply for a separate medical exemption. And then you have to apply for an Australian Traveller Declaration. And all of these documents are long. You have to upload a lot of information on the websites. It takes several weeks to do. It's a very complicated process. And so he would have had to have done all this before he even was allowed on the plane. Because when you fill in your traveller declaration, you receive an email back from the Border Force with a big green tick that says, it's okay, you can board the plane. And so when you go to the airport, people, behind the check-in counters, look at that tick and say, okay, you've been given permission. And I know instances where people who even have the big green tick have also been questioned by the airport staff, because it's so unusual to have someone go through this process to arrive in Australia, that they then ring Australian authorities to check this person is still okay to get on the plane. So Novak would have gone through a whole series of steps, and the paperwork is really quite onerous. So it's not as if he just jumped on the plane and said, I'm Novak Djokovic, let me in. That's not the case at all.
So on that, how does that happen? Because that's what most people will be wondering. You've explained it really well there. There's a visa process. He's filled it in probably with experts who are proficient at this with the money he has and the focus that was going to be on him. He's got on the plane and he's got there. Now, Jackie, you cover more than sport. You've covered politics in your time as well. Australia's got an election coming up. How do you put this situation with Novak Djokovic against the political situation in Australia right now? There's been a lot of comment from Prime Minister down.
There has been a lot of comment, and there's been a lot of, and it's played well to the domestic audience, that Novak Djokovic is not going to be treated any differently to anybody else, and that he has to follow the rules. Now, Novak Djokovic would say, but I did follow the rules. I filled in every form. I've provided what you've asked for. And he even has provided, in terms of medical evidence, because this seems to be the crux of the issue here. If he's unvaccinated, and we don't know, he's never revealed his vaccination status, and he says that that's a private matter, and perhaps it is. But in order to enter Australia, you have to reveal whether you're vaccinated. So if he's unvaccinated, he then has to provide, under the rules on the website, he has to provide evidence, a medical certificate saying that he has medical reasons to be unvaccinated. Now, that's all it asks for. It doesn't ask for detailed medical information. It just asks for this medical certificate. So you would think that he would have this when he got on the plane. But what has happened is that he's received, his medical situation has been reviewed by the Victorian authorities, the state body, in conjunction with Tennis Australia. And they've said, okay, are you vaccinated or not? Let's have a look at it. And they looked at these applications anonymously. So it wasn't as though this is Novak Djokovic applying. It could have been any one of a handful of tennis players. And they looked at his information and said, okay, we're going to approve you to play, and you won't have to do quarantine, which at the moment for foreign nationals arriving in Australia unvaccinated is 2 weeks. So he's trying to avoid sitting in a hotel room like what happened last year. So he has got that exemption, and he believes that this is his medical exemption. Perhaps the confusion there is that the Border Force is an Australian federal authority that require perhaps their scrutiny of this medical information has come to a different conclusion than what the state and the tennis authorities have done. In any case, it's a huge political football. We've seen Scott Morrison and the health minister speak very loudly and clearly about it. Domestically, as I said, it's played incredibly well. Internationally, I'm not so sure.
You mentioned Scott Morrison. We can now take a listen to the Australian Prime Minister talking about the world tennis number one.
I want to thank the Australian Border Force officers for doing their job, implementing the government's policy. And the ABF has done their job. Entry with a visa requires double vaccination or a medical exemption. I'm advised that such an exemption was not in place, and as a result, he is subject to the same rule as anyone else. I also want to stress that ultimately, this is the responsibility of the traveller. It is for the traveller to be able to assert and back up their ability to come into the country consistent with our laws. So they'll take advice from many places. No advice was provided by the Commonwealth Government, I underscore, but they will take advice, but it's up to them at the end of the day. And if they don't comply with the rules, then the Australian Border Force will do their job, and they have done their job. This is nothing about any one individual. It is simply a matter of following the rules.
I suppose the question is, should these sports events even be going ahead if Australia's so closed, if citizens struggle to even get back, if the country is generally closed? Would it be better just for the Australian Open to be skipping in a year?
Well, that's a really good point, because it's within Australia, they now have Omicron raging throughout the land. And because it has been shut down and they were very successful at stopping it coming in, where they had cases in the dozens, they've now got cases in the tens of thousands, which has come as a huge shock to the local population. And even just today, the New South Wales government has said, well, we're going to tighten restrictions. So I imagine over the next couple of weeks, as Omicron even escalates further, there will be an attempt by Australia to try and stop the spread further with more and more restrictions. So there is a really big question mark. But, to the economy, the Victorian economy, the tennis is a huge driver. We're talking tens of millions of dollars, employment by thousands of people, and they want the event to go ahead. And they're really, for one player, 99% of tennis players are vaccinated. So they, I suppose they make a calculated risk here that it's definitely worth going ahead.
Obviously, we know Djokovic is in this detention quarantine facility, and his family have said it's a sort of bug-ridden, prison-like conditions. That you've experienced in one of these sort of quarantine hotels in Australia. Tell us, what was your experience like?
Oh, it is horrible. It really is. I mean, I was in a 3-star hotel for 2 weeks without a window that opened. So essentially, I'm in a room the size of your bedroom for 2 weeks, and you're not allowed out. You can't talk to anyone. The only time you ever see another person is when twice they come and take a COVID test. And even that's quite amusing, because you've got to not step outside in the corridor and the testers are not allowed to step inside your room. So you're kind of both there shuffling up against the door frame, trying not to break the rules. So it's horrible. And he would be, because it's a detention facility as well, when his father says he hasn't had his clothes or access to his luggage, I think we have to believe that, because it would have been that he was just escorted to the hotel. It says it's a hotel, but it's certainly a detention facility, because this hotel houses a lot of asylum seekers and very long-term asylum seekers. So you have people who have been there for years, well over a year, waiting for a decision by the Australian government about their status, if they can come into the country. So you've got a lot of desperate people inside this facility as well. So it wouldn't be pleasant at all.
Is there a reason he's in this? It's called the Park Hotel, I believe. Is there a reason he's in that particular location? Is this part of the theatre a little bit, that he's in this place? I mean, we've seen images and stories about maggot-infested food as well for some of the residents there. It seems like, again, he could have gone to one you went to, which doesn't seem nice either. but it doesn't seem like the place you described with people waiting to be deported for over a year. These are waiting for asylum claims. Is there something significant in that as well?
No, it's all about him being treated like anyone else. So if you turned up at the border, didn't have the required visa, and was fighting to go in the country, that's where you'd go. I suppose it's all part of the, to try and stop people applying through this method, because you could end up for several years in a detention facility like this. So Australia has very, very fierce border policies. And this is all part of that theatre as well. But for Novak, he is not entered Australia. Officially has not been granted approval to step foot in Australia. So this detention facility is, I suppose, an extension of no man's land. And that is why requests by the Serbian government, very strong requests personally by the Prime Minister to move him to a better hotel, has not actually had any result, because to do that, the Australian government would then be saying, oh, we accept you into the country. And at the moment, they're not. Pending this court case on Monday, he's in no man's land.
Whereas one of his great rivals, Rafael Nadal, is actually in Australia, got through immigration, has his visa, and is all ready to play. And we've been hearing from him expressing some sympathy for Djokovic, well, effectively saying, you should just get jabbed, it seems.
And the only, for me, clear thing is, if you are vaccinated, you can play in the Australian Open and everywhere. And the world, in my opinion, have been suffering enough to not follow the rules. He makes his own decisions, and everybody is free to take their own decisions, but then there are some consequences, no? And of course, I don't like the situation that is happening. In some way, I feel sorry for him, but at the same time, he knew the conditions since a lot of months ago, so he makes his own decision. It's normal that the people here in Australia gets very frustrated with the case, because they have been going through a lot of very hard lockdowns, and a lot of people were not able to come back.
Tarek, Martin, how do you reckon this should end, or what is the best solution now actually to this? The compromise that actually just gets Djokovic into the tournament, or actually recognising how this will go down in Australia if the authorities are seen to give him an exemption beyond what perhaps he should be getting?
Well, from my point of view, this thing shouldn't be dragged out any longer. Jackie's mentioned the public will in Australia, the mood. It should be on the next plane out of Australia, and the tournament go ahead without. And this is going to be a stain on the tennis organisers in Australia. The silver lining here, perhaps, is it might, in a weird way, get people to be vaccinated. You don't want to go through this in a perverse sense. This whole episode, unedifying as it is, might have a positive consequence in that sense.
A positive consequence, but a negative result.
Yeah, yes, there you go.
Yeah, very good. I'm not sure about this whole thing. I mean, as Jackie says, if Omicron is raging throughout Australia and it's 90% vaccinated, it just shows. I mean, being vaccinated has no. I know from personal experience that being vaccinated it doesn't stop you getting COVID. I mean, it makes it much better when you do get it, obviously, and you don't suffer as much. There's going to be full crowds at the Australian Open. Certainly, that's the plan at the moment, I think. Which again, I think is quite a strange one if they're so sort of worried about, if the authorities are so worried about the spread of the virus. So I don't. There's no easy solution. Whichever way you do it, either there's going to be furore in amongst the Australian public, or I think there's going to be anger in Serbia. I think it's more likely that Djokovic won't be allowed to take part, but that's just a guess on my part.
Well, if I can just mention there, Tarek, the reason I think that Novak is really pursuing this to stay, Because seriously, if you were treated like this, you would say, get me on the next plane out of here, wouldn't it, you? So the reason is, if he doesn't fight this, he could face a 3-year ban from entering Australia. So he has to fight this to retain the right to go back to Australia in the coming years. And that could be very important when he's up to, becoming the greatest Grand Slam male winner ever, and perhaps a Grand Slam he's trying to achieve. So he wants to keep his options open as well. So that's quite a crucial point as to why he'd be putting himself through this, is to enable him in the future not to be blacklisted by the Australian government.
And that record, Jackie? One slam away from being the all-time Grand Slam leader, is that correct?
Yes, he's on 20 at the moment. So he's only just got to win this one at the Australian Open to be the best male. But we've also got, a situation he'd have to, if he did play, and there are some legal experts suggesting that he may be allowed to play because the court decision and the debate about this will go on for weeks and weeks, not just hours on Monday. So there could be a decision that he is allowed a reprieve for, say, 2 or 3 weeks to play, pending the court decision. But if he is allowed that situation, it would be incredible. I mean, the hostility he would face from the crowd would be quite significant, I would suggest.
The reason he'd face the ban for the couple of years afterwards, that be for breaching, or what would that be for?
Oh, it's because if you've had a visa revoked for any reason, you're then banned for 3 years. So he's arrived, his visa's been revoked because the Border Force says that he hasn't provided the required medical evidence, and then it could automatically be a 3-year ban. So he has to contest it.
Do you think this might have wider ramifications in Australia in terms of actually jolting authorities into relaxing everything, changing everything, or actually now there's such a hard line approach on this and not wanting to seem to be caved in, that actually it's a battle of wills rather than leading to sort of a wider easing, and finally more people can get back into Australia and holidays can resume, the economy can be helped as well?
Australia doesn't want that. They've been shut down for 2 years. They've been very happy and content not to have foreign visitors. And I think that the general person in Australia says, well, it's okay. We've got the blue sky here and the surf. Why do we need foreigners to come in? It's a very, and as an Australian, I find this attitude to be so perplexing and so devastating, really, because it's so against the image of Australia that I grew up with. It's difficult to reconcile, but Australians don't want foreigners at the moment while Omicron is spreading and the coronavirus is so uncertain. So they've got to have someone to blame. And at the moment, it's Novak Djokovic.
Jackie, you were in Tokyo. Tokyo was a bit like that as well. I remember being on the subway when we were allowed to be in outside of the bubble. And you did get the sense that a lot of Japanese people did not want us anywhere near them. There's a sense that foreigners were going to bring the dreaded lurgy to them. Is it similar there? Is that what you mean?
Yes, of course. I mean, I've experienced it personally, where friends of friends have openly to my face said, "What are you doing here? We don't want you here. You've come from, that plague-infested country of the UK. Go away." I mean, it's that brutal. It really is. I mean, there are, of course, many wonderful, beautiful Australians who the ones who have travelled and the ones who have a broader experience, I find, are far more welcoming. But at the moment, while this disease is spreading around, Australians just want to try and manage it as best they can. They, in Western Australia, they lock down with 1 case. They still believe that they can control the virus.
Well, Australia's got 18 months to go until it co-hosts the Women's World Cup with New Zealand, so it's going to have to be open by a venue, I'd imagine.
Yeah, or maybe they won't host it.
What a tantalising bombshell to end our conversation on. Jacquelin, thanks so much for joining us on Sport Unlocked.
Thanks, guys. It's been a pleasure.
That's Jacquelin Magnay from the Australian newspaper. Well, one man who's got a lot of time to travel very soon, although maybe not into Australia, is Ed Woodward. He's departing Manchester United at the start of February. the executive who helped to engineer the Glazers takeover of United in 2005, is on the way out and is being replaced by Richard Arnold, being promoted from managing director to chief executive. And they've promoted someone at Manchester United who's been part of the period of decline. Ed Woodward departing as pretty much a failure, we might say.
I mean, it's certainly, in terms of the on-the-pitch success, it has been a period of failure. Richard Arnold is known as a real sort of hard-nosed businessman. You know, he's the guy who's like pushed through these deals. People who know him well say he sort of doesn't leave a single pound on the table. He's sort of fairly bullheaded in his negotiations. So maybe they need somebody like that, but he's I don't think he's certainly not a football expert. And not that you'd say that Ed Woodward was as well. So it'd be interesting to see what sort of approach he takes, because I think they really need restructuring that club if they want to try and recreate success, because they just seem to be like spending money like it's gone out of business without any sort of significant result, even though they are sort of commercially successful.
Yeah, you mentioned reset. You know, we keep hearing about cultural resets at Manchester United over the last decade with various managers coming. Maybe there's going to be a boardroom reset as well, with Richard Arnold deciding, however tempted he might be, to get involved with talks with agents and getting into the football business, sexy part of it, realizing he might want to stay in his lane and leave that perhaps to the professionals. They've hired a lot of people in that realm, so maybe we might see something different. But a word on Ed Woodward. For me, to the Glazers, they owe him an enormous debt, and I use that word.
Is he claiming interest repayments on that debt as well? And claiming from them?
We got to cast our mind back to how the Glazers arrived. You know, there was a lot of acrimony. It was this phrase to a lot of football fans suddenly became a de rigueur, something that we all had to learn about. This idea of a leverage buyout. Essentially, Ed Woodward, when he was at JP Morgan, he was the banker that helped get this deal done for the Glazers. Hugely unpopular then, hugely unpopular now. Essentially putting hardly any money, next to no money of their own, into buying Manchester United, raising a bunch of debt and getting the club to essentially pay for the right of them to own it. And the value of the club has more than doubled, trebled in the time they've owned it. And that is a stunning piece of business for the Glazers, and they owe a great debt to Woodward. Perhaps that's why he was kept on so long. We've talked about years of failure, and there have been, but for them, it's been a money cow. It's been a real cash cow.
And as memorably, he once seemed to indicate it didn't matter if they won anything as long as they kept on generating more money. And of course, he leaves with United as the biggest money makers still in English football, but with their rivals catching up with them. Although, as we saw with Manchester City this week, one of the reasons for that might well be the latest couple of deals they have done from Abu Dhabi. We've got a hotel and what's the other one? What was the sister?
It was a company. It was a water treatment company or something like that.
Sister of Khaldoon Al Mubarak, the chairman.
Yeah, which is affiliated to the sister of Man City's chairman, Khaldoon Al Mubarak. Again, you know, we talked about Premier League's related party transactions. There is nothing wrong with having related party transactions, just the value of them. So you can have as many as you like. And City seem to be signing a fair few up. But, you know, just on back on United for a second, I think it's stunning. I didn't think it was possible for a company with the resources, or a team, with the resources that Manchester United had. It spent more than £1 billion since Alex Ferguson left, and it's only gotten worse. It seems to have fallen away. I just didn't think it was possible in the modern era for that to happen. It might, you know, in a way, it gives hope to teams on smaller budgets that, you know, run the right way. You could do well. I just think, I don't know how much worse on the field Manchester United could have done with Ed Woodward at the helm. Because
no trophy since the League Cup in 2017, no Premier League title since 2013, since not only Alex Ferguson retired, but David Gill stepped down as CEO too.
Interestingly, the Glazers are going to receive a dividend, I think, this month, 23 million is dividend pounds is going to be paid out. Most of it to them, some to other shareholders. So that just illustrates why they've been so loyal to their man. Woodward actually, I mean, he resigned following the Super League debacle. People, I've spoken to people close to him who say he was against it, and he told the Glazers he was resigning 2 days before the launch. But I think he has to bear a lot of responsibility for driving it through. Certainly in terms of the European Club Association and his position there, and his alongside Andrea Agnelli, and his link to JP Morgan, who were funding the Super League. Clearly, he may have disagreed with it, but he was certainly following his orders to the letter. So he's got to take responsibility for that too.
And quite frankly, he was there in power as executive vice chairman still the moment the Super League launch was triggered. Even if he opposed it, he was willing to split football, go against his fan base, having not even consulted them. So whatever views he might have held privately, he was willing to endorse this move and go through with it to that point on that Sunday.
I noticed some of the pieces in praise, in a way, of Woodward's time at Manchester United, or at least efforts to sort of leaven some of the criticism that were perhaps made here. And it made me think, you read the pieces and it's clear that Ed Woodward is the source of the material. And I just thought, again, it was like a very typical Ed Woodward move here. He's spent more on public relation advisors than perhaps any Premier League club in the time he's been there. There's been so many briefings out of Manchester United over the years. I mean, you would have thought, it's you're leaving. Why not do something on the record? There was so much in the copy that I clearly identified Ed Woodward as the source of what Ed Woodward is feeling. It might have been worth putting your name to it, but again, it's just like leaving through the back door with an anonymous briefing. That kind of sums up his time there, at least the latter time there, as the guy who's running the club.
Friends have told me that you're spot on the money there, Tarek.
Well, Ed, if you're listening, feel free to come on, speak to us in the pod. Now you've got a bit of free time.
Maybe Barcelona are in need of some of Ed Woodward's ability to bring in the cash. They're certainly in need of it. They've this week had to offload Philippe Coutinho on loan, at least, to Aston Villa, just to be able to register Ferran Torres having been signed from Manchester City. Yet we've got Barcelona talking about being back, ready to do big deals again, even while burdened with this massive weight of debt and having to take out loans. So what are these loans they've had to do, and what exactly did we hear from Barcelona this week, and how can they spend? What are the La Liga rules that allow them to do so?
Barcelona, of course, are in financial distress. It was one of the reasons they said they couldn't keep Lionel Messi in the summer. Let's remember that's only a few months ago. And then in January this year, they've announced, in fact, towards the end of last year, they announced they'd signed Ferran Torres for 55 million euros from Manchester City, but they haven't been able to register him. This is because of La Liga's financial fair play rules that limit the amount you can spend on new players to fit within a cap. Barcelona have bust through that cap a long way. So how can they do it? According to the La Liga rules, you can spend a quarter of any money you save by saving money on player wages or money you bring in from a transfer. And you can increase that by a half of the money you bring in if it's a player that represents 5% of your balance sheet. So essentially a top player, a big ticket player. And that is why they're so desperate to get rid of Felipe Coutinho and others in order to fund these transfers. Now, whether they're back is very hard to see. Barcelona is an extremely political club run by a president, Joan Laporta, who is always bullish, politician to the last, but the finances is still in absolute disarray. The club is 1.3 billion in debt. They've got a new stadium project and an arena project around that's likely to double that to eye-watering levels. Yet they seem to think that they're able to do it.
So I've read that Villa are not even paying his full salary though. Coutinho, they're only paying 65%. So it's still a sort of financial sort of predicament they're in, isn't it?
It's an absolute mess, Martin. It's an absolute car crash. But again, it's not Laporta's money. This is a member-owned club, isn't it? So you can promise the world and leave the problems for the next president, like the one he inherited, I suppose.
It can look like Jean Laporte is trying to actually give it the big talk, trying to sound like Barcelona really are unhindered by any financial challenges, while all behind him, he's trying to deal still with an unfolding wreck of a club and try to rescue it while trying to present the image of normality facing the public.
Well, we are in the era of the populace, so it kind of is on brand.
Another bit of football finance news. Bit of a development increasing from last week as we've been delving more into Chelsea's finances. Martin, what have you discovered about Roman Abramovich's contributions to the club?
The Fordstam company, which is the ultimate parent company of Chelsea, their accounts have come out which show Abramovich's total loans to Chelsea have topped £1.5 billion for the first time. It's an indication that he's continuing to funnel money into the club. You were there when he returned to Stamford Bridge, Rob, and he's attended matches for the first time in 3 years. Maybe it's a sign that he's sort of rediscovered his appetite for or perhaps his new Portuguese citizenship's helping as well. But yeah, it's a huge sign of the investment that he's put in since he took over. What does it mean in terms of Chelsea? Have they got this huge mountain of debt? Well, yes and no, because he owns a club and it's the debt to him. So if he was to sell it, he would effectively have to pay himself pay off the loans himself to himself.
But what can they spend this money on when he injects the cash into the club in terms of compliance with financial fair play rules? Because obviously they still have to generate revenue in terms of compliance, in terms of what you can spend on players.
It basically covers any sort of cash losses. So, there are many ways in which when you do your accounts that you can comply with financial fair play and still have a sort of cash loss. So, Chelsea, what they do is, they have a transfer splurge, but in terms of the accounts, that's spread over the length of those contracts. So if they spend, say, £200 million on players they each have 5-year contracts, that only equates to spending £40 million in a single year. And anything that they sell that year, then that means it's that is put as a potential as a profit. So that his investments or his loans help generate that transfer spending, basically.
Well, last week's pod we did touch on some memories of how Roman Abramovich was involved in Russia's bid for the 2018 World Cup, and we're back in bidding season again soon. It's all eyes on the 2030 tournament. Britain and Ireland had been put as amongst the main contenders for that, having, of course, not hosted the World Cup in England since 1966. But we're getting some developments on that this week at the start of the year, because it looks like now Britain and Ireland aren't going to go for the 2030 World Cup. And we did discuss this on the pod a few months ago in terms of actually how much can you be sure of FIFA's motivations on things? And does Infantino really want a World Cup going to a country that doesn't actually sound daring, ambitious in terms of the status? It's not taking the tournament boldly to a new frontier that he can tout as defining his presidency. And Martin, certainly from your reporting this week, you discovered that the focus of Britain and Ireland now is on Euro 2028 instead.
Yeah, there are some sort of fairly top-level meetings just before Christmas involving the British and the Irish and senior people in international football at UEFA and others. And I think the message that they got back was that it was too risky to commit to a World Cup bid. I mean, the English FA in particular is pretty unpopular in a lot of international circles. And you're quite right over like this Infantino's idea of some sort of grand gesture for the World Cup. So, FIFA have suggested having Morocco teaming up with Spain and Portugal to bring Africa a World Cup or part of a World Cup again. The Israeli Prime Minister revealed in October that it even suggested Israel or the United Arab Emirates sort of co-host the 2030 World Cup, which is a sort of Nobel Peace Prize idea, I'm sure. But yeah, so it looks certain now that Euro 2028 probably going to be up to 32 teams instead of 24. Will be the target for the British and the Irish.
Do you reckon, Martin, he's more likely to get peace in the Middle East than peace in football? It's total chaos at the moment, isn't there?
Well, I was going to say the peace in football is probably as problematic as peace in the Middle East.
The thing is, on the 2028 bidding, England and Scotland have only just had a load of games at Euro 2020 delayed until last year. Isn't it a chance for another European country to actually get some of these games? Doesn't it just look like wrong it's going back to Britain again so soon?
I think with UEFA, there is this kind of obsession with the UK, but primarily because of the money. We keep seeing the Champions League final as well, keep going back to Wembley.
Different excuses found. Anniversaries and different landmarks.
There is this obsession with London because they know also it's extremely popular. Weirdly, it's unpopular when it comes to liking England, when it comes to bidding, but these people love coming to the UK, particularly London, for events, staying in the hotels, etc. So it's a funny one, and I'm assuming that there won't really be any other candidate. We've talked about the World Cup bid for 2030, and we talked about how UEFA would like one European candidate, whether it would be British Isles and Republic of Ireland, or Spain and Portugal or whoever, and the UEFA president Jacquelin wants one. I think he'll also create a situation where there's only going to be one bidder for the Euros, and that way it won't be a popularity contest for Great Britain. It gives it kind of a chance to host it without any of those tensions.
Very much the no losers formula that we've seen in the IOC world as well, ensuring that uncontested bids take place to smooth out the process. Also,
guys, 2030, we talked about the this real tension if Gianni Infantino forces through a biennial World Cup, whether CONMEBOL and UEFA decide to take the ultimate step and break away. Should they do that? That would be an enormous tournament held in Britain by 2030. Isn't that the same? Isn't that what we're talking about potentially?
Well, and of course, technically 2028 is one of those years that FIFA would want as a World Cup year if they were to introduce biennial World Cups following on from 2026 in the US, Canada and Mexico. And as we start the year, Gianni Infantino is still not ready to write off the idea, but we have been hearing from his predecessor this week, haven't we? Sepp Blatter back on Twitter again.
It's quite funny, actually. He came out as a staunch opponent of the biennial World Cup, saying it will destroy the club game, and very, very much a blast from the past. He's had some medical issues, and also he's completely yesterday's man. It really doesn't matter what Sepp Blatter thinks anymore, does it? But what made me smile was way back in 1999, he was the guy who was pushing for a biennial World Cup, saying times have changed and the World Cup should be held every 2 years. You wonder what his motivations were for that intervention on Twitter this week. Anyway, it will pass. No one really cares what Sepp Blatter thinks, do they?
Well, not now, perhaps. Had a really interesting response to my World Cup reporting this week from Sir Howard Stringer, the former chief exec of Sony, who was at that notorious World Cup vote in December 2010, which awarded the 2018 World Cup to Russia and 2022 to Qatar. So Stringer, he was actually working for the Japanese bid committee there, and he was part of their presentation. And he says this is what he wrote in response to my story. He said it quickly became apparent that the fix was in. Blatter told me that England was an unsuitable candidate because there weren't enough good stadiums. A laughable thought. We were not allowed to talk to the other delegates, but I ran into President Clinton, ex-President Clinton, I should say, in the men's room and warned him, but he had guessed the outcome already.
Tales from the toilet with Bill Clinton, not a direction I expected episode 50 of Sport Unlocked to go to.
No, although I think that Japanese bid, Rob, was maybe ahead of its time. We were talking about the metaverse. If I remember correctly, the Japanese bid was based on holograms. and it would be, they were saying you could watch your team playing in the stadium in your own country. So imagine Wembley Stadium full of fans and England playing a World Cup match in Yokohama in a full stadium with holograms on the pitch. And you thought that was completely laughable. Today, we're now told that we are all heading into this metaverse where everything's possible. So there you go.
And now we are in 2022. This is the year that technology should have existed, because Japan wanted to host this year. So they should be able to roll out these games. We should be able to watch a Premier League game now in Australia, inserted into a stadium there.
Korea as well wanted to host this year. And I remember at the last World Cup in Korea in 2002, they had this big thing in the media centre about where they actually showed 3D football on this huge screen to show their technology. It was quite good, actually. You felt like you were actually standing behind somebody taking a throw, and this was going to be the future of broadcasting, but it never happened.
Well, instead we have got the future of football. We've got air-conditioned stadiums. What we haven't got is a summer World Cup with air-conditioned stadiums in Qatar. And I don't know if we're now told that reporting wasn't correct at the time, but there were supposed to be artificial clouds as well around the Qatar World Cup. Those we don't have artificial clouds. We've got some real clouds gathering over that event.
Well, maybe it was just deeming to be spending too much money on hot air, and actually this investment in sports broadcasting technology wasn't worth it at this stage, and actually it wouldn't deliver the returns if they were to put all this investment in. Well, we move on now to the big sports media story of the week unconnected to that, in terms of the $550 million purchase of The Athletic by the New York Times.
The Athletic was obviously launched originally as a sort of US sports subscription website, and then had a UK focus as well, looking just at football. It's never made money. It's lost money every year since its existence, but like all these sort of digital companies, it seems to increase in value. I've never quite been sure how that works, but anyway, $550 million seems a lot of money, but there we go.
Yeah, it's actually a huge bet by the New York Times company, which I should.
Do we have anyone from the New York Times we could call on?
But it's a massive bet, and you mentioned the losses there, Martin. If you drill down in the numbers a little bit, The Athletic, it lost 55 million on revenue of 65. So in very crude terms, it loses about $2 or £2 for every pound it makes at the moment. But it's grown a subscription base of 1.2 million subscribers. How many of them pay the full subscription rate? It's unclear. Obviously, the people involved in the deal would know that.
But the important thing is some people are showing that they are willing to pay for journalism. Obviously, whether it's the full price or some, that's been one of the key things that so many media companies have been trying to persuade people to do. Hand over cash. Don't just get the journalism for free online.
Yeah. And what it also speaks to this effort by the Times company to reach 10 million subscribers by 2025. It's just over 8 million at the moment. And, perhaps thinking we can't do it organically, let's just bolt on these subscribers. It's going to be an interesting project. But it's a huge bet. It reminds me, it's not the first time the company's made a big bet in the media market. And the last sort of one of scale ended in failure, really, in 2013. 20 years earlier, it bought the Boston Globe
for $1 billion.
Yeah, for $1 billion, Rob, and ended up selling it 20 years later for 70 million to the Liverpool owner, John Henry. The interesting thing here, it reminds me of Arsenal, again, using the football analogy, is New York Times has a lot of cash on its books, got about $1 billion. And that, some people say, will lose its value because of inflationary pressure in the marketplace if they don't. So it's time to spend money, and they've decided to bet very large on The Athletic here. And I just say Arsenal because there was a time where Arsenal had north of 125 million on its balance sheet, and it would just stay there, transfer window after transfer window. And there'll be fans saying, "No, we've got this money. Why don't you spend it?" And those fans, in the end, will prove to be correct. Because what happened was there was an enormous inflationary tendency in the football transfer market. It was a new TV deal because of Man City, etc. So when Arsenal first had that money, they could have bought 4 world-class players, really, when 25, 30 million was a big, big number. And in the end, they could only buy 1.5 players with this amount of money. So that's kind of the football analogy here. I'm also intrigued to see how this will work from an editorial point of view. There is obviously a sports department at the New York Times. There's we bought a sports journalism company in The Athletic. Different rules, different regulations, different standards. Perhaps it'd be interesting to see how all of that gets bundled together.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things with these digital companies is that if investment continues, where they launch and you have venture capitalists putting money in because they think the value is going up, and they're going to, as they have done, they've made a sort of bit of got a big return on their money. It's when it actually gets taken over by a big company and that investment stops, that's when things can change. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. The other interesting thing about The Athletic is when it launched, one of the creators said that we're gonna suck the talent out of every local paper and then let them bleed until we are the last one standing. So it's actually quite ironic now that it's actually going to be owned by a newspaper company that one of its founders said they were out to kill.
Yeah, a local paper.
Now, one thing that strikes me that would have shifted some of the optics of the deal and perhaps led to fewer questions about how the site fits in with the New York Times is purely around the corporate structures of the ownership. So while in London, the Times, the Sun, TalkSport and other media companies all have Rupert Murdoch as their owner, but they don't sit under a company named after one of the papers, but as News UK. But the New York Times is part of the company called the New York Times Company, which now has under it The Athletic, rather than again say Facebook being part of Meta with them removing Facebook as the main company name. It's just purely optics because, as they plan for, The Athletic and the New York Times will sit in the same corporation while being separate operations to continue their great journalism on their own paths. And The Athletic has shown that subscription models do work, attracting audiences willing to pay for journalism, as you've seen, Martin, at the Times of London, where people hand over that cash for subscriptions to read you in print rather than just hear you here on Sport on Lot.
Yeah, the Times was like went subscription only from just about the start of the whole internet boom. So it's always had a subscription model, and now it's obviously has many more digital subscribers than it does people who buy the paper. So everyone's looking to go this way.
Certainly the one thing digitally is we're seeing jobs created for journalists. And I noticed particularly within local media in the UK, 10 years ago, you saw the local papers getting smaller, reducing the number of staffing. But we've seen particularly with Reach, which owns the Mirror, regional papers like the Manchester Evening News and Liverpool Echo as well. They've invested in a lot of journalists, and a lot of those journalists are based around sport. And you've now got multiple reporters, say, covering Liverpool or Manchester United from those local papers, whereas, say, 10 years or so ago, you might have just one or two. So certainly we're seeing some encouraging signs in terms of reporting jobs that we didn't think might be there a few years ago, driven by interest in the Premier League. Well, that takeover is due to be completed in the first quarter of the year, and we look forward to developments on that from Tarek. Finishing up a spot of rugby news, and in English rugby, they do have the salary cap that has ensnared Saracens in the past, led to them being relegated from the Premiership. And now, could another club be falling foul of those rules too? The Leicester Tigers.
The Leicester are being investigated by Premiership Rugby over a separate company that was set up. The allegation is that players will be taken on, say they were being paid £200,000. They'd be guaranteed they'd be paid £200,000 a year. Leicester would pay a chunk of that, and say 30,000 would come from this completely separate company. In connection with image rights, and it's what we don't know is, well, did Leicester then pay this company? Was it a way of getting around the salary cap rules? That's what the investigation is focusing on. But it's quite an interesting sort of warning for any other competitions who take on salary cap rules, that surely whenever you do it, somebody is always going to try and get around it.
Well, isn't that's the case with every kind of rule when it comes to sport? We've seen the mess UEFA got itself into with financial fair play. The Premier League investigation into Man City is entering its third year. Clubs want to win, and they're going to do everything they can to do it. It's kind of rational. Are the regulators good enough to keep an eye on it? Remains to be seen.
And to find the web of financing that is often in place and how deals are constructed and the companies that are involved. Well, we've just about come to the end of episode 50 of Sport Unlocked as we enter 2022 and as we all prepare for the start of the African Cup of Nations, which will be going ahead in Cameroon next week. So much contentious talk around that. So many clubs hope to stop their players maybe from going from Europe. So many disparaging comments from European institutions, but looks like they're finally going to get the AFCON going ahead after this is, I think, the fourth attempt. They've had various delays along the way getting it in Cameroon.
Yeah, well, let's hope it can go ahead and run smoothly. It's one of these tournaments which I quite like, because to me it sort of still seems away from the sort of the glitz and the glamour. It's still a bit earthy, isn't it? The African Cup of Nations, which I quite like.
It is, and if you're from one of those countries, it's as big as the Euros was for England or Italy when they won. It's hugely popular. Sometimes when we're thousands of kilometres away from there, certainly from the club, they see it as this distraction. But it's so popular and so important to the people from the countries that are participating. Winning that is as big as winning any regional tournament.
Well, a busy start to the sports year, and hopefully in his spare time, sitting in Australia waiting for the outcome of his hearing, Novak Djokovic is finding Sport Unlocked to listen to as well.
Happy New Year to everyone. 50 not out, Rob?
Incredibly so, and with very few complaints over the last year. And, of course, you can listen back if you've got a spare 2 days to continuously listen to every single episode so far. And when you're doing so, you could get voting in those Sports Podcast Awards, because the details are available at our Twitter feed. That's at Sport Unlocked on Twitter. Follow the link, and if you just register and listen to the clips there, it allows you to vote for us. And who knows, maybe some success, the pod can become even more regular and bigger and better. At least someone's listening, and we've been grateful to have your company for the last 50 episodes. And you can send us any feedback at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook, on Instagram. And of course, if you hit subscribe, we'll automatically land in your pod feed. But for now, enjoy the sports viewing in the days ahead, and a Happy New Year.